Okay guys, welcome back to lecture 2 for week 5. And this is IDC208A, Environment Design 3, Module 3. We're moving on now to looking at using lighting, AV technologies and merchandising systems to really accentuate that optimal brand buy-in that we're working towards. So as we've already learned, the role of retail has drastically changed in the postmodern consumer age to be about this experiential driven idea. And these experiences have really set the foundation for the relationship between the consumer and the brand. So when we use this event theory to craft a consumer experience within a space, we can systematically make decisions about the intensity of the experience in each zone that we're creating. And the same applies when it comes to integrating lighting and AV technologies and designing merchandising systems within those zones as well. The function of specified lighting differs from the role, and this is really important to be aware of. The function of lighting is always and will always be purely to illuminate, but the role of lighting is to provide visual cues for the progression of the consumer journey, as well as a subconscious order of importance of that journey. So if the lighting within your retail space is of all of the same level, it's very, very difficult from the consumer point of view to determine where the important areas of that space are. It also doesn't feel particularly ambient. So we talked earlier about this kind of phenomenon of ambience, and simply having, metal halide all the way throughout a retail space makes for a really uninspiring, unengaging retail space. And a consumer is really, really hard pressed to understand the hierarchical structure of the space as well. So they're not quite sure where to start. They're not quite sure where to end. It's very difficult for them to find what it is they're looking for. And I'm sure many of you can identify with this as I'm discussing the principles of it as well. So the event theory essentially is this framework that I've developed over the years to make it a really systematic process and make it very, very easy for us to make sure that we're designing these high impact spaces in a way that allows for optimal brand buy-in and optimal engagement between the consumer and the brand. We can determine the type of lighting that we need to specify within these zones as well, based on that sort of event theory. And these directly align to the intensity of a particular zone that we're looking to create as well. So it's basically a step-by-step process to make these decisions very, very easy for you. So when using the event theory, we can assign different lighting types in the following ways. We can look at the everyday events. So these are the low intensity events that we're trying to create as the areas where we just have general lighting. The memorable moments we can look at as the medium intensity events, and there we want to really use accent lighting or task lighting to accentuate the kind of engagement within those spaces. With the major milestones, remembering that these are the key items on the journey. So these are the key stopping points that we want the consumer to journey towards. And these are high intensity experiences. So we really want to make these the feature lighting points of our space. And if you think about retail in general, most retail spaces lack that kind of hierarchy approach to lighting. More often than not, it's only one kind of lighting, perhaps two if you're lucky throughout a space, but really adding increasing dynamics with the lighting, again, helps to individualize the experience. It helps to give the consumer a roadmap for their journey throughout the space as well. So we're then able to use this as a map for continuing to support that idea of ebb and flow throughout the consumer journey and throughout their travel in the space. So ultimately, this impacts the memories of their experience and in turn, the ongoing relationship between the retailer and the consumer. So let's take a look at the everyday events or the general lighting zones. Remembering that the everyday events provide the context for our experiences. So these are the subconscious effects of our perception, and they also influence our behaviors in terms of how we feel we should act or engage with a particular brand. In a retail environment, this isn't any different. So in the everyday events, the consumer journey can be classed as the background information. So these are areas of the store where the general product is being displayed. And in those areas, we can use general lighting when designing a retail space or a retail experience. So this lighting should often go unnoticed by the consumer, but it has that kind of dramatic effect on this phenomenon of ambience as well. So these events are low intensity and should demand little conscious attention from the consumer as well. And again, when you think about most retail spaces today, they're often very, very bright and very, very noticeable to the consumer that they are in a very glary environment. So essentially, with this particular framework, we're just paring back that general lighting, making it quite ambient, quite welcoming, and ensuring that we're providing these sort of layered experiences that are accentuated with our lighting schemes. So if the general lighting in the space is quite dark, it might give the impression of warmth, rest, exclusivity, and secrecy to the consumer and so forth. Whereas in contrast, if the general lighting is really quite bright, it might give the impression of energy, vibrance, freshness, openness, and so forth. And again, this general lighting, while it shouldn't go noticed particularly by the consumer, it has a dramatic effect on this kind of idea of ambience. And a consumer will make a decision from the outside of a space as to whether or not they feel okay about going into it based on that idea of ambience. So we can apply this general lighting to areas such as the circulation zones and also the general product display areas, so the areas where the usual catalogue of products are being showcased. From a distance, this has a really direct impact on the consumer's choice, and the general lighting should help the everyday events to just fade into the background and provide context to the experience. So what do I mean by that? I mean that a consumer can broadly look across the bank of information or the bank of product that are located in those zones and make a decision based on whether or not they feel the product is appropriate for them or not. Okay, and essentially what these everyday events should be doing is allowing the memorable moments and the major milestones to shine. So there are always going to be the consumers that come into the space in the hunt for a product located in the everyday event, and that's completely fine. They're usually coming in driven by knowing what they want, and they're not always there to have a intense experience with the brand, because normally they would have a fairly thorough knowledge of the brand and what it stocks and sells anyway. But what we want to do is really make the memorable moments and the major milestones the heroes. So these are the major points of emotional interaction for us between the consumer and the brand. We want to let those really be the focus of the space. So in those memorable moments, we can use accent and task lighting to really accentuate those events and make those chance happenings or occurrences much more powerful for the consumer. So in a retail context, we can think of this in terms of the consumer falling in love with a product they didn't expect to find, or even learning something that they didn't know before the journey. So these could be points of information engagement with the consumer or feature products of the season and so forth. These events are of medium intensity in the experience. We can also use lighting to assist in this and to make sure that that experience is really carefully orchestrated. So this can be utilized as an effective tool to encourage the consumer to continue on their journey throughout the sort of general content or the everyday events. So you want to make them visible enough as marker points within the space so that a consumer will sort of continue to progress throughout that space, but you don't want to make them so vibrant or so loud that they completely detract from everything else around them. And then we have the major milestones. So the major milestones are those big ticket items or those key events on that retail journey. And in the retail context, we can think of it where the consumer is engaging physically with the product and whether it's the most emotionally intense moment of engagement. So this might be the change rooms where a consumer is trying on a garment, or it could be a product testing zone, for example, the ASOP basin stations where you can always try the product. It could be observing the production of a product. So if there's a custom area in a store where you can get something etched or, repaired and so forth, these are the physical engagement points of the store and the major emotional exchanges. So in these instances, this is where we want to put our feature lighting. So these events are of really high intensity on the experience scale, and they're also the major decision points of the consumer's journey. So we want to make them really, really special. At these events, we can use feature lighting to support that process and the interactions in taking place as well. So the feature lighting can also be used as a visual marker throughout the space. And if you think of the retail space as a whole, if you locate feature pendants, for example, above these major milestone zones, it makes it really simple for the consumer to see from a distance where the major points of interaction are on that journey. So just as the role of lighting in retail is really, really important because it provides information about function and brand and so forth for the consumer, so too does the merchandising system. So while the primary function of any merchandising system is, of course, to display a product, in the postmodern consumer market, the style of these merchandising systems are also helping the consumer make a choice about whether or not the product is particularly right for them. So they can't purely be based on function alone anymore. So the process of merchandising a retail environment today has to be focused primarily on an experience being created. As such, the decisions have to be driven by the effect of that particular system on that interaction. So simply popping a bunch of shelves on a wall doesn't really cut it in today's marketplace anymore. So in context of the everyday events, or this is where we retail the standard stock items, so the items that are the everyday faithfuls and staples of that brand. And specifically, these can obviously change in color and flavor and style every season, but they exist in the brand's sort of catalog of product continuously. And so what we do in terms of merchandising here is something that is fairly low impact. It's quite unobtrusive. It just supports the product as a whole and helps to provide context to the overall experience. So it should still be materially and geometrically and stylistically appropriate to the brand and its aesthetic, but you don't want it to be a showpiece. As far as the memorable moments go, these are where we showcase our seasonal items, and these can also be points of engagement with your consumer. So it might be education or inspiration of the consumer, it could be digital ordering stations, it could be infographics, it could be seasonal setups. So it might give the opportunity for the consumer to imagine a product as part of their home by setting up a little scene. These points on the journey are designed to capture the consumer's imagination and encourage them to sort of pause and think about how that product might actually fit into their life. So you want them to be stopping points on the journey and moments of sort of consideration and ponder. So you want to give them enough focus, but not so much that they're detracting immensely from the rest of the experience. These events might also present the consumer with context to the product so they can scene set and so forth. And then, of course, you've got the major milestones. So these major milestones, again, are those major stopping points on the consumer journey. And this is where we feature promotional items and feature items. So these are rotating quite quickly in terms of the product display turnover. But what you want to do is create a focal point of presentation within the store so that consumers can see from a distance where those marker points are. Again, if you think about it in combination of the lighting and the display system as a whole, if you've got some great feature lighting and some really beautiful merchandising systems working together to present focal drama to the product that is displayed on them, then a consumer will automatically be attracted to that product and feel more engaged with that product and perhaps follow through to purchase. So these are the products that the consumer aspires to have. So engagement with them in the merchandising system is really, really emotional, and we need to sort of orchestrate that in the best way possible. So these should be visually easy to be identified from a distance, but also captivate the consumer's imagination. A successful retail environment allows the consumer a varying intensity of events throughout the journey. So by giving them a couple of points of major focus, a couple of points of, general focus and something on the journey that they sort of notice along their way, and then providing context to all of that with the general display systems, what we're doing is really creating this variation and this ebb and flow so that there are points of rest and points of engagement, and it just accentuates the entire experience to be far more powerful. So merchandising systems are one of the primary tools that we have at our disposal to help to create this ebb and flow. And coupled with really great lighting, Together, they work really well to create a beautiful emotional experience. We can then further accentuate that experience using audiovisual systems, and certainly as technology is improving and we're progressing more and more towards highly technically engaging environments, AV systems are starting to play a really important role in this kind of postmodern consumer retail market. What they do is really provide an opportunity for a consumer to interact with the brand on a whole different level. So previously, consumers would be interacting in sort of a two-dimensional way on their phones, iPads, computers from home with the brand, and then they might progress to going into a store. We're moving to a space where the two sort of need to be integrated together, and one should accentuate the other. So while retail environments might become these showcases or galleries, if you like, for products, there's no reason why shopping as an activity still couldn't happen within the space, even if that's happening digitally. So some AV systems that you could and should definitely use to accentuate that consumer journey is sound, of course. Projection could be used, digital displays, information kiosk, interactive digital systems, and generally any digital media. So again, this doesn't mean proliferating the entire space with plenty of digital interaction points. It means being very clever about the digital engagement that you set up within the space, but ensuring that it all adds to the overall experience and doesn't detract from it. So AV systems are not only a great way to get additional information about your brand to the consumer, they're also a really largely untapped resource for involving them in it. So there's, ways that you can gain statistics constantly about the kind of consumers that are shopping within your space. You can also communicate information to the consumer about things the brand is doing in terms of the larger kind of global social or environmental consciousness. So there really are many, many benefits to including these audiovisual systems in the experiences, and largely we are not really tapping their potential. So at the moment we're just sort of showcasing digital LED display screens, and perhaps every now and then you might see an iPad sort of interaction point within a space, but other than that it's sort of been largely unexplored. So as we talked about earlier, we discussed this kind of phenomenons of ambience very briefly in the weeks gone past, but ambience is essentially this term that we use to collectively describe the overall experience of a space. It's a really complicated concept because it encompasses how our sensory perception of a particular setting translates into a long-term emotional impression of that space. And it's one of the most important factors we have in creating experience, and lighting and AV are absolutely major influences in terms of the ambience of space. So utilizing lighting and AV in that retail design really allows us to carefully orchestrate the consumer experience by directing them through the events that we've set up, playing with intensity and playing with engagement points and rest points on that journey, and creating an experience that includes not only energy and intrigue, but also opportunity for rest and consideration allows that experience to be far better absorbed. So in the earlier weeks, we discussed this idea of if everything is equally intense in that experience, then a consumer will more likely forget what's happened because there's no sort of opportunity to absorb what's actually going on. So essentially, retail is theatre. And what you're doing is putting on a show about your brand. So consider cinema and theatre without lighting or sound. It would be really difficult to relate to, and the audience would sort of completely disengage from it as a whole, particularly the audience of today's market. So the role of lighting AV is to contribute that drama and that heightened sense of engagement with the customer's experience on their journey. So overall, over the course of the last few weeks, we've looked at lighting, AV, merchandising. We've looked at the event theory as a systematic way of spatial planning. We've looked at brand translation equation and how you can use that as a methodology for really ensuring that your decision-making processes in terms of how you design, what you design, and how you implement it into your actual space is really effective and is all part of a common language and conversation that's really layered and rich and about your brand rather than driven by aesthetics alone. Together, that has now provided you with a really practical, systematic roadmap in terms of how you can plan out these spaces without struggling with things like creative block or struggling with where you might place particular products or systems and how you might orchestrate that journey. So what I've created is just a really simple guide for you to use when you're going about planning your spaces now going forward for your assessment. And essentially, if you go back to a couple of lectures ago where we looked at the ASOP case study and we used that event theory to briefly zone out the everyday events, the major milestones and the memorable moments. If you decide on those fundamentally as your first port of call, then you can systematically make decisions about all of the other elements in order to support those. So if you are designing an everyday event, you want the intensity of the experience to be low. You want the product type that goes on that display to be of the usual catalog. You want 3 to 5 interaction zones. This is obviously scalable depending on the size of your tenancy, but in a standard sort of tenancy, 3 to 5 interaction zones with the everyday events. These can usually be located on the wall or the central floor. You want the display type to be repetitive and low focus, but still to be able to be, supportive of the brand, and you want the lighting type to be general. If you're designing a memorable moment, you want the intensity of the experience to be of medium level. You want the product type displayed on those displays to be featured, seasonal or impulse-based purchases. 2 to 4 interaction zones is usually ample within a standard sort of tenancy. These can be located on windows, on central floor, on point of sale. And you also want the display type to be more customary. So you could use standard stock items from display agents, but putting these together in a way that is representative of the brand is suggested so that you are fundamentally supporting that sort of brand aesthetic and that brand story and really orchestrating optimal brand buy-in between the consumer and the brand. And again, if you're lighting these memorable moments, you want to look at task lighting or accent lighting to, make them be sort of a mid-level engagement. Then, of course, you've got the major milestones. And these are the high-intensity interaction points, and these are the promotional or featured product or featured experience. So remember that a major milestone does not have to necessarily showcase product. It can be an experience like trying on a piece of clothing, for example. 1 to 3 interaction zones are usually appropriate for this in a standard tenancy. The locations can vary depending on the actual activity or product that we're showcasing. So again, if we look at ASOP's case study, a major milestone on their journey is that product trial station with the sinks and product displays, and that's located in the central floor area, whereas generally speaking, most change rooms are located in the rear of a tenancy. So again, it's variable where they're located. Now, these display areas and display types are where you can go crazy. So this is where you want to design the custom featured display pieces and really go all out with designing something that is representative and, stylistically appropriate of your brand. And you want to make them visual draw cards within the space so that they draw the consumer from entry to those major points and then again out through the journey at their exit point. And these are the parts of the journey where you would have feature lighting. So as you can see, it's a really simple guide, and using this systematic approach should make the decision-making process really, really simple in the design of your space and ensure that you are enabling loads and loads of ebb and flow throughout that space, creating lots of intense interaction zones, but also creating rest stops for the consumer so that that engagement is optimized and the brand buy-in is optimized as well, and the consumer wants to continue to come back to that space, thereby forging a sustainable relationship between the brand and themselves. So hopefully that all makes sense to you, and this guide can provide you with a really simple approach to designing not just retail spaces, but all design projects as a whole. And following this, you should be able to create really dynamic, interesting spaces in all of your projects. Again, if you've got any issues or questions about any of this, please pop onto the forum. I'll answer any questions that you have there so everybody can stay abreast of that. And also feel free to join our Collaborate sessions if you'd like to discuss or chat further. Next week, we will be delving more into designing specifically for your projects coming forward. And other than that, I will see you in the Collaborate.